Welcome back to District Crossroads. We're talking about a historic, yet little understood section of the city that planners call the North Capitol Crossroads. This massive section of D.C. encompasses the Armed Forces Retirement Home, the McMillan Reservoir, and the Washington Hospital Center. But it doesn't really have a single label on a map of the district. You can think of it as the bridge between better-known neighborhoods like Brookland, Petworth, Bloomingdale, Parkview, Stronghold, and even a few others. Now, in a previous podcast, we met some of the people and places that make this area special. In this episode, we're going to talk with local activists and historians to help us understand how we got here, and along the way, talk about what the North Capitol Crossroads area has to do with Abraham Lincoln, the interstate highway system, and the return of a lost city park. We're also going to get to the bottom of why there seems to be so many fences here.
They wanted to put actually a prison at one point.
This is what I heard. They're coming, they're coming, they're coming.
And I think it's one of the great stories of local activism and just what it can do.
This is District Crossroads, Episode 2, Making History. And I'm your host, Bridget Todd. District Crossroads is a podcast about the neighborhoods and neighbors in and around DC's major intersections. We're looking at the events, the institutions, and the people that have shaped them up until now, and that will continue to shape them as we chart a new path to the future. And it's brought to you by the DC Office of Planning. The Office of Planning performs city plannings for DC's neighborhoods, corridors, and districts, and has begun an effort to gather oral histories and other multimedia content to document the voices, experiences, and future visions of DC residents. Okay, let me remind you where the North Capitol Crossroads is located. The area sits on either side of a 1.5-mile stretch of North Capitol Street, starting at the southern end of McMillan Reservoir along Bryant Street, moving north toward Michigan Avenue and the Cloverleaf intersection at Irving Street, ending at the cemetery north of the Armed Forces Retirement Home. Take a look on a map. What I just described to you is a huge piece of land. Let's start on the grounds of the Armed Forces Retirement Home, or AFRH. Recently, I dropped by the property and saw some things that, frankly, I had not seen around DC before. There was a pair of peaceful ponds, a sprawling, wide-open field of view, and the sounds of birds and small animals just doing their thing. It's actually kind of easy to imagine what the space was like back in the day, but it really invites one to think about how many different ways this space has been used. This is a really special space. Standing there helped me shift my focus and let me see what this part of the district would have looked like before we started building our roads and our metro tunnels and reservoirs and trolley tracks. You don't really appreciate that you're high on a ridge until you look downhill toward downtown. Yeah. Wow, being here really gives you a different sense of perspective, given that we're standing here looking down on a construction crane. This geography is actually going to play a role in our story here. Stay tuned for that. Let's start at a time when the land was the domain of the local indigenous people, ancestors of the Piscataway, who still live in the DC region. Back then, they lived predominantly along the Anacostia River, but hunted throughout the area. Incidentally, there are large numbers of deer on this property today. What's hard to appreciate is how different it must have felt here in a hilltop forest versus down by the low-slung riverside. But that difference keeps coming up here in this area we call the North Capitol Crossroads. Let's explore a bit more and fast forward. Next time you're driving down Harewood Road, I want you to notice a quirky little stone building across from the Basilica. Compared to the buildings around it, the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception, the Ukrainian Catholic National Shrine of the Holy Family, and the St. John Paul II National Shrine, it's small, but it screams historic, and actually, it is. It was here even before the Civil War, when this area looked a lot different. Let me introduce you to Robert Molesky. He's a former public radio producer who now spends a lot of his time researching and writing about the history of his neighborhood. He also has a blog called Bygone Brookland. He's going to tell us a little bit more about this area.
to make everything clear for anyone, at that time, everything north of Florida Avenue was Washington County. That differed from Washington City or from Georgetown. There were three entities that made up the District of Columbia, and those were the three. Well, this was all largely farmland. That meant there was a lot of open land. There were only farm roads through Washington County. Rock Creek Church Road, that was part of a road from Georgetown to Bladensburg, even before Georgia Avenue developed. Very early on, they were both two big tobacco ports. That road, the Georgetown-Bladensburg Road, was the major crosstown before there was a town. It preceded the formation of Washington, actually.
Alongside this road, especially west of North Capitol, you'd find some vast estates. Some of them likely worked by enslaved people. One of those estates was owned by William Wilson Corcoran, the wealthy banker, art collector, and Southern sympathizer. The gatehouse I described to you earlier was actually once a gatehouse to his estate. But with the adoption of a simple ordinance in neighboring Washington City, the look of this posh, rural landscape was about to change.
After the city decided that cemeteries could no longer be built within the city boundaries, this area became ripe for cemeteries. So Glenwood Cemetery was the earliest one in this part of the city, 1854, I believe. And it was huge. It was 100 acres.
After Glenwood, 4 more cemeteries were established nearby. They were part of the broader build-out taking place north of Florida Avenue. Around this same time, George Washington Riggs, that's right, as in the former Riggs Bank, sold a large tract of nearby property to the federal government. That deal included a cottage on the property. It's very of an era. The cream and brown, I feel like, is a color spectrum that you don't really see a lot of. I also think, like, cottage, I was expecting something smaller, and it's actually quite grand. More like a mansion. Anyway, that Riggs property, including the, quote, cottage, is now the site of the Armed Forces Retirement Home, formerly named the Old Soldiers' Home. Here's how that happened.
The Soldiers' Home started 1851 after the Mexican War. General Winfield Scott, who was in charge of the army, in essence held Mexico City hostage and said, "You give me a big tribute or I burn down the city." They gave him a big tribute. When he came back, he said, "I want to use that money to start a place for the people who fought this war and our other wars." Congress at first did not want to do that, but the winning general of the winning side had a lot of sway at that point. So that's how the Soldiers' Home started, with tribute money from Mexico.
And it didn't take long for other high-profile Washingtonians to notice the pleasant climate and beautiful views from this property. In fact, President James Buchanan would enjoy some quiet time up at the cottage, as would the president who came after him, Abraham Lincoln. During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln would come here to get away from the stresses of downtown. Up here in the fresh air, where he worked on writing one of the most important documents in the history of our country.
Abraham Lincoln stayed there every summer, well, really from May through October, every year that he was president. And he wrote the Emancipation Proclamation while he was at the Soldiers' Home.
That's right. The document that decreed the end of slavery in the Confederacy has a direct historical connection to this very neighborhood. Today, Lincoln's Cottage is a cherished landmark in the North Capitol Crossroads. But there was a time when this incredible history was basically forgotten. So walking around the grounds, we've talked a little bit about how back in the day, it was more of a community space where people have memories of running around here, walking their dogs here, really using this space. Lewis Maiden, a neighbor on the Petworth side of AFRH since about 1960, has memories of the cottage from long before it was renovated and reopened to the public in 2008.
We used to play around the Lincoln Cottage and run all up through the porches and acting like we was swashbucklers, some of the spokes in the railings. We didn't know it was the Lincoln Cottage. We didn't know it. We didn't know it. We were just playing there. It was play for us.
Now, returning to our story, after the Civil War, you really start to see some of these big, grand structures that we see today coming up. After the Soldiers' Home, it was Howard University's turn.
Of the colleges in the area, Howard was the first, immediately after the Civil War, 1867.
The idea started with a push to establish a school to train future Black ministers and teachers. But what would become Howard University quickly grew into something far more ambitious. Within a few short years, it was graduating doctors, dentists, and lawyers. Howard was the nation's first HBCU. But it's done more than break racial barriers. Did you know that Howard also produced the first Black female lawyer in the country? That was in 1872, and her name was Charlotte E. Ray. For comparison, Georgetown Law School didn't graduate its first woman until 1953. Over the years, Howard has grown to encompass 256 nearby acres and remains an integral part of D.C.'s cultural and educational life. After Howard came Catholic University, which was also formed to train seminarians in the nation's capital.
The woman who was most responsible for starting Catholic University, Gwendolyn Caldwell, her father was a wealthy, very wealthy Kentucky man, made his money in gas lights. She offered $350,000 to start a university. There was no Catholic university at that time, not a university, not that did graduate level teaching. Gwendolyn Caldwell was the final deciding factor as to where it would be.
The site she chose had an interesting history itself. During the Civil War, a lot of the forested and agricultural land along D.C.'s ridgeline was fortified. Fort Reno, Fort Totten, Fort DuPont, all of these familiar places are actually old Civil War forts built to defend Washington. Well, there was a fort in Brookland as well, Fort Slemmer, and it was built atop a nursery.
Where Fort Slemmer was, which is now on the campus of Catholic University, there was a 24-acre plot, small. And the guy who owned it was a florist. He had a greenhouse downtown, and he used this land to grow sod and ornamental trees and things like that. And because it was so small, when the Army decided they needed to put a fort there, in essence, they tore down everything.
Well, to make a long story short, the land was never much of a nursery again. Within a few decades, it would be sold off and would become part of Catholic's campus. Now, when it first started admitting students in 1889, Catholic was pretty much all male, but before long, a push for women's education took hold, and as a result, Trinity College was established in 1897, right across the street. Perhaps no one has seen as much of that history as Sister Mary F. Hayes.
Doing the math, I'm 88 years old. Currently, I serve as archivist for Trinity Washington University.
Mary has been part of this community for over 65 years. Her office holds everything you can imagine an archivist would have. Posters, news clippings, oral histories, photo albums, old yearbooks, you name it, she's got it. Pretty much anything they don't know what to do with seems to wind up in Mary's office. And she is more than happy to share those memories.
We travel the world on the 80B land trolley.
The trolley that connected B-Land, or Brookland, to downtown ran along Michigan Avenue and south on North Capitol Street. These play a recurring role in Mary's recollections.
So we were dependent on trolley cars. We always went down North Capitol Street. We took the trolley to concerts at the Constitution Hall. That was long before Kennedy Center. We took the trolley to go to the movies. We took the trolley everywhere. And you wouldn't even think of taking a taxi. You know, that was an extravagance.
Walking or trolleying around the neighborhood, Mary and her friends frequently came across the boys from the place she calls C, or Catholic University.
My memory, We walked to Brooklyn, and the guys from C would yell out the windows, "Trinity girls wear army boots." It was an insult. What they were doing is insulting us because we were smarter than they were.
I'm guessing Mary had a sharp reply for those hecklers. From Mary's vantage point at Trinity, near Michigan Avenue and Franklin Streets, she's seen a lot of changes to this part of the city. Those trolley lines took her and her friends from place to place. And you know what? If you look at the Metro bus map today, you'll see remnants of those lines. Bus routes like the 80 and the 54 are the same route numbers and pretty much mirror the trips that people were taking on rails a century ago. But one thing I did find interesting is where the trolley didn't go, and buses still don't go today. Like north on North Capitol. There's a reason for that.
Woods. It was all part of the old soldiers' home. I mean, this is all federal government land.
Remember Lewis Maiden? The one who would play pirates on a falling down Lincoln's cottage? Well, he spent a lot of time exploring the land north of Michigan Avenue as a kid.
Very beautiful, very scenic. People would say, oh, this is scenic, this is beautiful. Woods, undeveloped. We rode bikes and walked through, hiking through, just wandering around, going in different parts of Northwest. Maybe been on a bicycle, maybe running. We were blessed to have such a large domain.
It's hard to imagine a time when North Capitol Street ended at Michigan Avenue, but this was the case up until the late 1950s. And in fact, it was even a struggle to get the road that far in the first place. But there was no stopping the momentum. The area was still growing, still becoming what we see around us today. In 1958, shortly after North Capitol was extended, you had the establishment of the Washington Hospital Center, which would quickly become the largest hospital in the district. Walking around the hospital center recently, something really stood out to me. I've never really thought about how many fences and barriers there are in this part of the city. But once you start looking at it, it's like all you can see. The fencing across from the hospital center, across Michigan Avenue to the south, is impossible to miss. Fencing surrounds multiple blocks of land, stretching from 5th Street Northwest to North Capitol. Except for a break at 1st Street Northwest, the fence is continuous and encompasses a reservoir, water treatment facilities, and an open flat area along North Capitol. For decades, people have been debating what to do with the land that it now cordons off. Let's go back to the late 19th century again and see how this happened. Remember what we said about people coming up this way to enjoy the cooler temperatures in the summer? Well, they were also escaping the bad water and bad air in the densely populated downtown section of D.C. The city had a problem. People were getting sick. Around this same time, the Federal Macmillan Commission was in the process of sketching out the locations of the museums, the parks, and the monuments we are now familiar with. Part of that effort also involved putting up a reservoir here. The water in this reservoir would be filtered through sand in caverns below that large flat area you can see along North Capitol. It was a fairly ingenious way of getting the pathogens out of the water supply. The Army Corps of Engineers got to work on the site, finishing the reservoir in 1902. And the site was more than just a part of our city waterworks. It was also a park. Part of the effort designed by Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. was to design a park around the iconic silos, industrial features of the site which are still visible today. Well, these silos are incredible, and it's funny because I've passed by and looked at these silos, and I've never really thought about a vision for what they could be. I think they really are an interesting part of the city. Sarah Schoenfeld is a local historian who's been digging into the connection between race and land use in the district. The project she co-directs is called Mapping Segregation.
Mapping Segregation has been documenting the historic use of racially restrictive deed covenants throughout much of the district during the first half of the 20th century. These were agreements and deeds that restricted entire neighborhoods to whites only. One of these neighborhoods was Bloomingdale. The park was actually one of the things that was used to market this new neighborhood and get people to move there. They were going to have access to this expansive green space.
There was a premier playground at the south end of the reservoir site by Bloomingdale that was segregated. It was for whites only. However, a large park that sat atop the sand filtration site was for everyone.
If you look at old photographs, you'll see there were actually walking paths between the sand silos. The reservoir grounds also sort of functioned as an extension of Howard University's campus, in that there really was no barrier between the grounds and the campus. So this was just a beautifully designed park that was, importantly, accessible to Black residents. This was one of the few such spaces in the city that was available to them, certainly in this part of the city.
But with World War II came a host of new security concerns.
But in 1941, there was a fence erected around the reservoir grounds. This was World War II, and this was something that happened at other reservoirs around the country as well. So at this point, nobody could access the space.
After the war, Bloomingdale filled with Black residents, and the fencing around the reservoir and the sand filtration site remained, and have remained to this day. I think about how differently we would experience this part of the city without these fences. There was a time when my own family would use this space around the reservoir to connect, but in a different way. My mom used to work at Children's Hospital, and she would have her lunch outside looking across the reservoir at Howard University. Years later, when I got my first job at Howard University, I would have my lunch outside of the cafeteria looking across that very same reservoir at Children's. It never occurred to me that there was a time when my mom and I could have just met in the park by the reservoir, spread out on a blanket, and enjoyed lunch together. Oh, that's nice. Well, eventually, the sand filtration system became obsolete. The plant was decommissioned in 1986 and later transferred to the district government. So what then does the district do with that giant chunk of fenced-in land sitting on some prime real estate? Well, there have been a lot of ideas about that, and a lot of court cases too. Tony Norman is a lawyer and local activist who has been at the center of some of those fights.
Yeah, a federal lawsuit blocked the Macmillan because they wanted to put a prison at one point, and we sued them and filed an injunction, and we believed it was a historic site. The city opposed that, and we legally fought to be a historic site.
So that site could have become a federal prison. Imagine how different this podcast would be if that had happened. Well, things have already started to change on this site. The activism here led to years of legal wrangling, saving it from becoming a prison and securing historical status for the silos. Currently, the south end of the sand filtration site is morphing back into a large park, including a playground, recreation center, and pool that is expected to open in 2024. A mix of affordable, market rate, and senior housing, a grocery store and medical offices to the north are soon to follow. Maybe, once again, a small piece of the vast North Capitol Crossroads will serve to connect surrounding neighborhoods and institutions, rather than separate them. This area actually has a long, storied history of activism. Let's go to the 1960s and 70s, a time when the country was expanding into the suburbs and building a vast highway system to connect those suburbanites to urban centers. But here in Washington, D.C., that plan ran into trouble.
Congress really wanted the highways. The city really didn't. And so what had been built was stopped, and what was expected to be built was never finished. 395, if you ever take 395 under the mall, and then comes up and ends at New York Avenue. Why does it end there?
Actually, I think about that every time I hit that traffic jam where the highway ends.
It was supposed to extend further north through our neighborhoods.
That's right. That highway was supposed to keep going north from Southwest D.C. through Brookland toward College Park, Maryland. The impact of freeways crisscrossing the city, the noise, the smell, the physical obstruction would have had a profound effect on the North Capitol Crossroads area. But what could local residents do?
Before home rule, the Congress wanted to build highways all across the city, in essence, carving it up. Brookland would have had an 8-lane freeway right next to the railroad tracks. But the city had relatively little power. It had no home rule. The mayor was appointed. City council was appointed. And they were trying to do what the city wanted, and what the residents wanted was a subway. They did not want these highways.
The project was so close to happening that some began to leave the area, and not necessarily by their own choice. Sister Mary was also involved in this issue, representing Trinity College on the Northeast Coordinating Council, a group that opposed highways. She remembers the anxiety that permeated nearby neighborhoods.
When the leadership were stopping 395 from going through the district, there was one guy, every time I got up to speak, this is what I heard. They're coming, they're coming, they're coming, they're coming. He had this paranoid obsession with them. And at that time, if you remember, there's a row of houses that had already been evacuated. They're very attractive row houses, but they were abandoned because they were going to be demolished.
Well, those houses at 10th and Franklin Streets in Brookland weren't exactly abandoned. They were taken by eminent domain because they were in the path of the planned freeway. I think you can guess how the people in this area reacted. There were protests at the public meetings and a lawsuit. They fought tooth and nail to stop the federal government from paving over their neighborhoods. So back to Robert Molesky's question.
Why does it end there? Because of those protesters. That's where they stopped it. And it took time, but the plan was, in 1971, completely jettisoned. That's where they stopped it. I think that is one of the great stories of Washington, D.C. history. It's one of the few times the city got together and showed that it can have some power, even without representation in Congress, if we all work together on something.
Still, in this neighborhood, there's a remnant of this highway building era, the highway-style cloverleaf intersection at North Capitol and Irving Street.
And so, yes, I think that then made the Irving Street cloverleaf with North Capitol Street nothing but a remnant of that, not only that plan, but that kind of thinking, that getting people around the city is more important than the people who live where those roads are.
There's a lot in Robert's last line. Should we really be designing places to be driven past so quickly? Or should we let a place be, well, its own place, and design it with the needs of its immediate neighbors taking a bigger role in our thinking than the needs of those who just want to get from point A to point B as quickly as possible? This is one of the many challenges facing our city planners today. As we've learned in the podcast, the places we pass by every day are full of stories, if you just stop and look around a bit. You can't tell by looking now, but in just a few minutes of walking, you can pass by a lost Civil War fort or the place where Lincoln worked on drafting the Emancipation Proclamation. Meanwhile, beneath your feet is an old hunting ground, and around you, a woodland that once gave people room to roam. But at the same time, our needs as a society change and populations grow. And 20 years ago, who knew we'd have to make space for electric bikes and scooters? The North Capitol Crossroads area is about to go through one of its most profound transformations in generations. The fencing around the sand filtration site is coming down, and when it does, Washingtonians are going to see the return of a public park surrounded by much-needed housing and historic open space. Once again, this place has a chance to serve as a place where neighborhoods connect. Anita Cozart is the district's planning director.
As we heard in the recounting of the Crossroads past, storied institutions reside in this area, each with a deep and powerful history. These institutions have ingrained themselves upon their surrounding communities and have been shaped by their neighbors and neighborhoods as well. That history and that interplay between institution and community in the North Capitol Crossroads deserves to be remembered and shared with new generations that will make their homes here. Similarly, we should learn from residents' history of activism and engagement to make racial equity central to our plans for the future. Historically, urban planning has been part of racially discriminatory and exclusionary systems that have harmed Black residents, other people of color, and their communities. Through this planning effort, we not only hope to reconnect neighborhoods that have been physically separated, we also seek to partner with these institutions that have shaped neighborhood history. As we continue this planning process, we want to hear from you, the listeners. How can we work together to lift up those who have been left out of the area's prosperity and create a more equitable future for all? How can we work to make these institutions even more a part of their surrounding communities? And what new connections can we forge between them? How can we work to remove barriers and make the streets, sidewalks, parks, and plazas more accessible and beneficial to all? Visit northcapitalcrossroads.com to chime in.
Once again, check out northcapitalcrossroads.com. This is Bridget Todd. Thanks for listening. District Crossroads is a DC Office of Planning production. Writing and direction by Interface Multimedia and Velo Media. The interviews were recorded by Prologue DC, a woman-owned historical research firm based in Washington, D.C. Urban planning and design consultants were led by Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill. Our theme song was composed and performed by DC's own Oh He Did,